Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brianna Lopez, and I'm a third-year doctoral student in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. It is a privilege to be able to introduce this week's speaker for the PRC Friday seminar in collaboration with the Center on Aging and Population Sciences, Dr. Marilyn Thomas. Dr. Thomas earned her bachelor's in biology and microbiology and master's in public health and community health from San Francisco State University. She earned her doctorate in epidemiology from the University of California, Berkeley, where she was also awarded the prestigious Ford Foundation predoctoral fellowship. She is currently a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Thomas is a social epidemiologist who investigates the mechanisms by which structural racism contributes to racial inequities and chronic disease risk, premature aging, mental illness, and mortality. Her research has focused on three key domains of Black experiences that uniquely impact Black health: policing, race-based discrimination, and education. As a postdoctoral scholar, she received a K-99 award from the National Institute on Aging to study the impact of historically Black colleges or universities on late life cognition among Black adults. Her presentation today focuses on the measurement of structural racism in public health research and details how structural racism is related to racial inequities in chronic disease risk, COVID-19, and being killed by police. At this time, I would like to remind you all that part of the culture of the PRC is that during the Q&A following Dr. Thomas's presentation, we reserve the first two questions to come from graduate students. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Marilyn Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you for that very warm introduction. I appreciate that. Welcome. Please come in, grab a seat. I recognize one person coming in, Dr. David Che. Hello, welcome. Please make yourselves comfortable. Okay, so I'm super happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. That was a great overview of what we're going to talk about today. And I want you to think about this as like an introduction to racism, or structural racism research. So the good news is that we're going to cover a lot of basics, but the bad news is that it's a lot. Like it's a lot. And so you will have access to the slides, and we can't take a deep dive into every concept, but of course we can have a Q&A, and I'm around, and there's my email. So happy to always have you follow up with me and ask questions. Okay, and it's really interesting that I'm doing this topic because I see some racism related workers in the room. Dr. Gooseby, we've never met, but I recognize you, a few others, but welcome. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so this is the agenda for today. We're going to define structural racism as a social determinant. I'm going to discuss current study methods and measures in the literature. I'm going to present some of my findings very briefly, and then share some ideas about what we might be able to do about it before we get to the Q&A. Okay, so you all know that I'm at UCSF, but not many of you know that I was actually born and raised in San Francisco. And this map on the left shows you the racial distribution of our residents in San Francisco based on the 2020 census. And all of the racial groups are non-Hispanic except for Hispanic. So you can see our Asian residents are in this this is a little hard to see here, but it's this royal blue color. Our Black residents are in this yellow color. We have Hispanics in this kind of teal, and our white residents in this taupey brown. And I was born here. So this is called Bayview, Hunters Point. We called it HB, but now it's gentrified, so it's the Bayview. And you can see the cluster of yellow Black residents right there. And the Bayview it's the largest, most underserved Black community in San Francisco. There are not a lot of health promoting resources or wealth building opportunities. So the residents of Bayview are disproportionately exposed to a lot of harmful risk factors for disease. For example, this is the median income in San Francisco, and darker colors represent higher incomes. And you can see poverty is really high in the Bayview. This map shows, oh, that's right. I wanted to contrast it, because even though this is high poverty in the Bayview, this is unlike more predominantly white neighborhoods in San Francisco. This particular one is called Pacific Heights. And you can see the median income is a lot higher, right? The median income actually for Black families is $30,000 a year, and it's $110 for white households. So it's almost 4 times higher. And what's worse is that the residents in the Bayview pay, or spend more than 50%, a large proportion in darker shades, spend more than 50% of their income on rent. And this map shows the medically underserved in red, which includes much of the Bayview, which likely helps explain the huge disparity and premature death for Black residents compared to all other racial groups. You can see Black residents represented in these green squares here, and see how it's skewed heavily to the right. Actually, the top graph shows you the years of life lost for males and females on the bottom. And males die most often from homicide, but men and women both die disproportionately from drug use. Now, this didn't all happen by accident, right? It was by design. The map you see on the right is a federal and state sanctioned map. Many of you may have seen before. It's used by the Homeowners Loan Corporation to outline areas considered desirable and undesirable, right, for mortgage lending purposes. And you can see that the green areas are first rate, the best, and the red areas are the worst. And they called this a security map, right? And this was used to essentially, well, many of us have heard the term redlining, right? This is an example of that. So this 1937 map of San Francisco was used to ensure that only white families were sold the desirable homes in the equitable or the affluent areas, and Black and brown families were essentially sold and rented the rest. And as you can see, Bayview is among the worst areas, whereas Pacific Heights, it was green. It's one of the best, right? So if you just kind of stand back and look at this map, you can see how deleterious the effects of redlining has been on people of color, families of color in San Francisco for generations. I mean, residents of color continue to be overrepresented in the most marginalized districts of our city. And this is an example of structural racism, right? The ongoing policies and practices that unfairly advantage people or advantage white populations and unfairly disadvantage people of color. And redlining is one way that we can conceptualize structural racism as a social determinant of health. So, as we all know, racism is driven by racial prejudice, racial bias, and racial discrimination. And there are key differences between them. For example, we can think of racial prejudice as uninformed assumptions, right, about members of a racial group, whereas racial bias is when you're actually ranking members of a racial group by social status or value. So you can have a positive bias, a positive bias towards some racial groups and a negative toward others. And this is very different than racial discrimination, right, where you're actually treating people unfairly based on their race. And all of these forms of racism can be conscious, like you could know your bias, or it could be unconscious. And it's an important distinction because one can engage in one form of racism and not others, knowingly or unknowingly, right? Like, so in this, depicted in this image, we could argue probably racial prejudice, definitely discrimination is happening, right? But other examples could be like an employer might only hire people that look like them, which would be a form of discrimination, without necessarily having any prejudice, believing that every other racial group are bad workers, right? So it's important to know those differences. Structural racism, which is what we're here to talk about today, isn't an assumption or an act, right? It doesn't even need to be perceived. So then how do we define structural racism? As we know, racism is historically rooted in explicit laws and policies that date all the way back to the founding of the US, right? Which was built on the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant workers, and of course, the enslavement of Africans. And racism essentially has been maintained through explicit policies and practices that essentially concentrate wealth building opportunities to white families and white people. So scholars, many of us in the room, have long argued that structural racism is multidimensional and complex. And it ranges from the individual level to the structural. And although there's no standard definition yet, and work recently published that my team and I recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine, we've described structural racism as historical and ongoing interactions between macro level systems and institutions that constrain the resources, opportunities, and power of minoritized racial and ethnic groups. Now, although structural, systemic, institutional racism are often conflated, we think about structural racism as essentially comprised of 3 separate domains. And each domain of racism they have different qualitative constructs that are not necessarily interchangeable. And this is important not only to think about how we study structural racism as a social determinant, but also how we develop interventions to combat it. Now, if we think about this in the construct of the socio-ecological model, a lot of us are familiar with this, but this is a framework of overlapping rings showing the range of intersecting social factors that put people at risk of disease. Again, ranging from the individual to the systemic, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to focus on the top 3 levels, all of which contribute to differential access to health promoting resources by race. And so if we define these, let's start with systemic. So we can think of systemic racism as, so systems of power tend to regulate and organize the structure of its institutions, right? You can think of that like similar to UT, right? You have a whole system, and the University of California, right? We've got Berkeley, we've got UCLA, we've got UCSF, but it's all within the UC system, right? And these different institutions are separate and they also have separate cultures. And so all of those constructs are different. So that said, we can think about systemic racism as racialized systems of power that are seemingly colorblind, like not race conscious, but ultimately they may have policies and practices that perpetuate discriminating individuals by race. Cultural racism is a little different. So cultural racism are the societal norms, standards, and values that are assigned differentially by racial group, like what a professional hairstyle might look like, right? Or professional, cultural clothing, for example. And then, of course, the one we all mainly understand is institutional racism, which is racialized laws, policies, and practices carried out by state and non-state institutions that are racially discriminatory. An analogy from chemistry, I borrowed this from one of my mentors, Gilbert G. But this is an incredibly strong molecule of carbon atoms organized like a soccer ball. And this can help us think about the strength and the interconnectedness of these 3 different domains. And we're going to use criminal justice as an example. So compared to developed countries, we know that the US has the 6th largest incarceration rates and these huge disparities in sentencing severity and length and bail and fees and all of that disproportionately impact people of color, particularly Black Americans. Now, compared to white folks, Black folks are more likely to be stopped by police, to be arrested, to experience use of force, to experience lethal force, and to be convicted of a felony. And if you do become a felon, you can lose your right to vote, you can earn lower wages, you can be denied student loan funding, you can be denied housing and employment. So all of these institutions are involved. And then, of course, social media and news outlets essentially influence the extent to which Black and brown people and immigrants are perceived as dangerous and criminals, right? Which then contributes to over-policing and higher incarceration rates, and around we go. So this whole system essentially works together, right? To essentially prevent the elimination of Black-white inequities in socioeconomic status and in health by essentially reinforcing the existing mechanisms or creating new mechanisms to maintain the status quo. Okay, and there's a lot of evidence for this. So in a recent examination of structural racism in health in the US, Bailey and colleagues report this list of social and health inequities in the Lancet. And we can see differences in white compared to Hispanic and Black adults. And I'll just go down to point out a few. You can see median income and not San Francisco, even though it's bad in San Francisco. But nationally, you can see, Hispanic and Black families, well, white families have more than 10 times more wealth, okay? We can see unemployment rates are almost double for Black folks than white folks. We see incarceration among males is 6 times higher per 100,000 for Black compared to white. Men, we see higher proportions reporting poor or fair health, which likely contributes to disparities in mortality from diabetes, for example, and heart disease. So why is it important to interrogate structural racism as a social determinant? Put very simply, right? Because racism hurts. And if there's no other message you go home with today, I hope that we understand that it doesn't just harm people of color. It harms white and racially advantaged groups too, because, and I'm going to show you some of my work today that shows this, and there's a growing body of literature supporting this, but it's mainly because, human talent is equally distributed in our society, right? But racism ensures that opportunity doesn't happen. And that undermines us as society as a whole, right? So it hurts. And I threw these in here because I was like, I know I'm going to show you my work, but I don't want you to take my word for it because of my example in San Francisco or like some of the stuff I'm going to show you about. There are dozens and dozens of studies showing how various forms of racism and racial discrimination can or contribute to a wide variety of health outcomes and risk factors. Those are just some of my favorites. Okay, so now in trying to understand how structural racism can actually get under the skin to impact health, we can use this conceptual framework, and it's essentially an indirect pathway linking those structural level exposures. And many researchers in the room here, some OG researchers, the biopsychosocial mechanism we know very well, but just to highlight it in the context of structural racism, these upper level, like very far from our health outcomes of interest, they're very distal, but we have those structural factors that then lead to the kinds of policies, practices, and norms, right? The distribution of cultural capital, distribution of political capital, all of those things that then determine, again, a more distal mediator, what kind of environment you're exposed to. So your environmental exposure, right? The amount of discrimination you might experience, your socioeconomic position, what neighborhood you live in, how often you're policed, right? And all of those things, all of those environmental exposures are then mediated at the individual level through essentially the stress regulation pathway. And it starts with primary and secondary stress appraisal, right? Like, is this a threat or a challenge? Am I being pulled over because I ran a red light, or am I in danger? Like, am I at risk, right? That's a very different stress process. And then, do I have any way to deal with this stressor, regardless of whether or not I feel like it's a threat or a challenge? And all of those responses, however you appraise that exposure, is then mediated through, or there's some psychological, physiological, and behavioral response that then determines what kind of risk factors of disease you might have, like your inflammation and stress. All of those things play a part. And then, of course, that's linked to some health outcome. These are health outcomes that I study. And so all of this pathway that I've put together is completely rooted in the literature. So, and social theory, of course, but all of this is supported by literature. And then I wanted to add this. So published this year, Ahmed and colleagues, they essentially conducted a scoping review of the global evidence operationalizing structural racism as a social determinant. And you can see here among the 54 studies, and the literature was from 2000 to 22. And you can see among the 54 studies, most of which were in the US, the study designs were largely cross-sectional in design, followed by lit reviews, and then we had some qualitative and quantitative studies. But here's what I find most interesting, because a couple of things stood out to me when I saw this. First is that there's a clear absence or a gap in studies using causal frameworks or causal inference methods. And if we're talking about intervening on structural racism, we really need to start to think about causal frameworks. So that was really absent here. The other thing that stood out to me was that, actually, I'll show you on the next slide because I think this one is really interesting. They put together, based on the literature, this kind of list of how they categorize all of the exposures in the study that emerged. But the most common were racial discrimination, housing, and socioeconomic and sociodemographic indicators. Most studied was educational attainment. But here's what was interesting to me is oftentimes structural racism researchers, or historically, I should say, because we're changing, the field is growing. And it's very common to see measures of inequality, like racial segregation, operationalized as structural racism. And I posit that it is not. These are consequences of structural racism. Like the redlining policy, for example, that was an actual policy, a practice that then determined which neighborhood you live in, and what resulted was racial segregation. So just something to think about as we're moving forward in the field and the field is growing. We need to really think about, are these measures actually capturing what we think we're capturing? So that stood out to me. And again, so these measures you will also notice are essentially unidimensional measures of exposure to racism potentially or inequality. And again, as we said in the beginning, if we look at that big carbon molecule, right, it's very complex. And so we need methods that can capture that complexity. Unidimensional measures don't really get at that. And so a lot of us are advocating for index measures or measures that can capture the multidimensional nature of structural racism. The most common were concentrations at the extremes, dissimilarity index, and these two measures, again, are measures essentially of inequality, not necessarily direct measures of policies, practices, and norms. And I myself have used the everyday and experiences of discrimination scales. Those are very common. Oh, and then adding to this evidence, last year, Atkins, Jackson, and colleagues, they reported on the most feasible and promising approaches essentially to study structural racism as a social determinant. And the big takeaways were put in this really nice succinct table, so it's easy to follow. And I'm going to highlight a few, but the one that they listed first, I also thought was like the most important, so I was super happy to see that. Their advice, the first thing was, do not use race as a proxy for racism. And the reason is because race is a social construct, right? Comprised of culture, language, religion, and yes, phenotypes like skin color and hair texture and all of that too. But it itself, and again, it's at the individual level, but it itself is a social construct that represents a social hierarchy of who will have access to resources and opportunities, right? It does not itself represent those complex institutions and systems that govern the distribution, right? So we don't want to use race as a proxy for racism or structural racism, but sometimes all we have is race, right? So what they recommend is, which I also support, is if you're going to use race, use it with a lens of intersectionality, where you're considering race in addition at the intersection of some higher level policy or institution. So for example, they just happen to use race in redlining, and now we know what that means. So that's an example. If you're going to use race, try and use it with some higher level construct. Time is also a really important dimension of racism, but I'm going to circle back to that. I wanted to pause here because, again, we're starting to talk about what are the best measures, the way, not only how we measure structural racism, but how we estimate it efficiently in our models. And so there are a lot of emerging methods presenting kind of novel ways to measure this, but they all have their strengths and weaknesses, and I literally could do a whole course on that. But what I wanted to do is just kind of highlight what's emerging in the literature, so you know. Structural equation models essentially are, a lot of people are using these. I'd love to have a conversation with other health equity researchers who do this work and have seen this method, because I'm learning a lot about it. But basically, if you're not familiar with structural equation models, what they do is they essentially identify constructs that are essentially important but not directly measurable by finding relationships within the data, observed characteristics within the data, and some latent constructs. So an example would be if we were to try and model racism, people are using essentially like inequality measures like Black-white differences in incarceration or education or self-reported health, with racism as a common cause of all of those inequalities, and then measuring this as a latent construct. The two most common, actually, let me go back. The two most common are latent class analysis, which is essentially finding characteristics that are similar and grouping individuals like alcohol users and tobacco users, and factor analysis, which essentially finds groups using correlations between the variables. Multi-level and generalized equation models are really good at evaluating cluster data, like looking at individuals within neighborhoods or following individuals over time. And I also wanted to mention this last one. Has anybody heard of META, the META method? Okay, so my colleagues and I did essentially a lit review on intersectionality research. This method has popped up, and then we met the person that developed the method, and it's amazing. I'm not really clear on what it's doing yet, but essentially what you can do is you can group individuals across a wide variety of social identities like gender, race, sexual orientation, all of these things into one construct without blowing up your model. So you can get stable estimates, and you're essentially interpreting the residuals as the additional burden or the additional effect. So it's just something you should keep your eye out on. I'm starting to see it a little bit more now. Okay, so now we're going to circle back to time as a dimension of racism. And we can think about time. Time is, in my mind now, it's starting to become one of the most important components. We were talking about this earlier. One of the most important components of racism, exposure. And we can think about it in terms of frequency. So like how many times you've been exposed, like, oh my God, did I just get pulled over once? Or am I being discriminated at work every day, right? Then you can think about it in terms of duration. How long that exposure actually lasted can be very different, have very different biological implications. And then the life course, super important. Had this conversation earlier. We can think about this in terms of age, like I experienced discrimination in childhood, but not in adulthood. What might that mean? Critical periods, brain development, like if I'm having stress as a kid and it affects my brain development or my cognition, what does that mean later in life, right? When I'm an adult, about my cognition. And of course, or that's also latency, right? So critical period is childhood, brain development gets disrupted, later life functional limitations are possible. So we want to think about that. And then of course, birth cohort. I cannot stress this enough because over time, our society, as you all know this, we have varying levels of tolerance of implicit and explicit racism. It changes. And so you really need to think about your population that you're studying in terms of their birth cohort. I myself am working on data where everyone right now, the mean age is like 75. So that means all of them were essentially born in the 1920s and 30s. And so you have to I had to completely rethink some of the exposures and mechanisms just based on the birth cohort. Now, importantly, racism absolutely can affect more than one life course at a time, right? So there are important intergenerational racism. Shout out to Dr. Busby. But yeah, like we have to think about this. So what I thought I'd do is I'd put together a diagram so we can really visualize and see what this really means. So we have a fictitious person who's going to be midlife right now. So we're going to round to 50 years old. So they're born around 1975 or whatever. And then we're going to think about a 100-year duration, 1920 to 2020, also rounding. If this person's midlife right now, theoretically, there could be plausibly be 4 generations, right? Across a 100-year period. We've got the grandparents, the parents, the individual who's now 50, and maybe they had a child, right? And the way that I set this up, because we are in Texas and my father was born in Paris, Texas, just shout out to Texas. I made the first 2 generations from Texas and then the last 2 from California. And if I do that, automatically, half of this family's generation were exposed to legal racial segregation in the South, right? So that's just on Jump Street. Then if we think about the first generations, the policies that cause differential opportunities by race, I'm just picking randomly some common ones we may know. Of course, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, we know about that with redlining, right? That was implemented in 1932, which was the same year as Tuskegee, right? And then we move forward in time, we've got the GI Bill and Brown versus Board and the Civil Rights Movement and welfare reform. But the important thing to note here is that happened to the second generation too, right? It's not just, even though the ages are different, they were both exposed to all of these policies. And I put the red line there so you can see how long the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that practice of redlining was implemented. That had implications for both of these generations, where they lived, where they couldn't work, how much wealth they earned, all of those things are implicated. We move on up in the 1980s at decimated families. We see the beating of Rodney King. Across the next 2 generations, the Clinton crime bill in 1994, which decimated families of color. In California, we had the 3 strikes law. And then we had 1996, affirmative action was banned in California. In Texas, it was, what, 2008 or something? I can't remember the year. But anyway, but it was banned here. Then, of course, we had the election of Obama. So kind of culture shifting, but then the backlash, right? The rise of white supremacy, which then inspired Black Lives Matter movement, as well as Charlottesville as a backlash. And then, of course, the murder of George Floyd. So if we just kind of take a pause, we can see that racism isn't, the harm of it isn't, oh my God, I was walking down the street and somebody dropped the N-word at me, right? That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the effects of racism. And we have to be thinking about this level of complexity if we are starting to think about how it impacts our work, our research questions, the populations that we're studying. It is much more complex. So keep it all in mind. Okay, I don't want to move really fast because I want some conversation and I'm not even in my work yet. So just really quick, on a positive note, because that was a lot. Everybody can take a breath. But I wanted to make this point too, because we as social epidemiologists, we tend to focus a lot on risk and things that cause harm. But I think it's really important to also think about sources of resilience. And I even like cringe when I say resilience. I hate that word. I mean, there are some contexts that I'm getting used to it, but when I use it, what I mean to say is we can focus on factors that are health promoting that might actually buffer the negative effects of racism on health. So we should also be thinking about those. And I have some examples here, policy, like we can look at investments into neighborhood improvements, see how they're doing. We can look at the cultural level, initiatives related to increasing economic empowerment, and also in our institutions. You know, everyone's opening up these DEI programs and this and that. We need to be doing, well, either way, there's a lot of stuff happening on these campuses, and we could be doing like internal evaluations on anything we're doing to make sure this thing that we think we're doing, we're actually doing, right? So those are some recommendations. Okay, so I added this slide because yesterday, so it's going to take up a couple of minutes, but the promising news is that since 2019, we've had an explosion of structural racism research, right? This is from Dean and Thorpe, and you can see after 2020, it like exploded into 3 times high, right? So most importantly though, that's the spike. So it's very clear that the 2020 protests of the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent global movements, the Me Too, all of that is played a role. It has suddenly become a priority in scientific research, which is really good to see. And I'm happy to hear that. There's also a lot of funding streams that have created opportunities for people to do this work. So we welcome you. Absolutely. But there's also been kind of a, notwithstanding the good intent, there have been some adverse consequences. And I'm sure you all have heard of the term health equity tourism. Raise your hand if you've heard of that. Yeah, okay, so some people haven't. Good, because not good, but I put the definition here. I wasn't sure if I needed to. But so health equity tourism is a term that has been used as a phenomenon that describes investigators without prior experience or a commitment to health equity research who come into equity research simply because of the prioritization and the new funding streams. And it's, again, we've wanted this for a long time. Before, even though this is happening, you can see the trend. Structural racism research has been under-resourced and understudied for decades, right? So we need this research. But there's some adverse things that are happening because if you don't understand, and we just talked for half an hour about the complexities of structural racism, right? If you've never had any exposure to these ideas, you could really do some harm in designing your studies and calling it health equity, right? Or even calling it racism research, when really it's racial disparities research or something else. But some nuggets to be conscious of. If you're not really working with an expert in health equity research, you risk harmful studies, mischaracterizing those root causes we were talking about. It can complicate solutions that people are designing, and it can also disempower health equity researchers. We were talking the other day about how I've actually left projects that I was hired as a consultant because of my expertise, and suddenly everyone wants to do health equity research, and I've had to leave and pull my name off projects because not only were they not really listening to me, but the methods that they were using were going to be harmful. So this is a term that's out there. Please don't let it intimidate you. We can also have a conversation about why it's targeting the researchers and not the institutions that control the funding streams, but I digress. This is a paper that kind of called attention to this. It's been read a lot. Many of you may have read it, but it offers some guiding principles for novice researchers. So if you do want to do this work, please be sure to center representativeness, not only in your study population, but in your collaborators. Empower them, especially the experts. Incorporate social theory. I cannot stress this enough. Consider the potential harms, because when you are oftentimes doing this work, how you report your results and the context can actually be misinterpreted in a lot of ways. So be very conscious of any potential harm that you could be causing by reporting, and also sustainable impacts. We don't want to do work that is quick and dirty in this field. No short-term solutions ever. So think about, if you're going to be doing this work and you want it to be impactful, make sure that impact is sustained. So that's why essentially my work centers on Black lives and Black experiences that uniquely impact Black health. And as it was mentioned in the introduction, these are the 3 domains that I've focused on. So I'm going to share some of my work where it shows essentially not potential, but anti-Black bias in policing. So please forgive me, I'm going to go through this fast because I'm over time. So in one study, I essentially aimed to identify any law enforcement policies that may help prevent police killings. So I examined law enforcement policies essentially as predictors of race-specific fatalities. And I used two data sources, to do this, the Counted and the LEMIS databases. So very briefly, the Counted is compiled by the Guardian newspaper, and it's a public use database of the total number of people killed by US law enforcement during 2015 and 16. And there's about 2,200 people, sadly. And importantly, this includes agency level data. And then LEMIS is a cross-section of government data collected approximately every 3 years from a nationally representative sample of US law enforcement agencies regarding their characteristics. And this database had 2,800. So what I did is to ensure that these policies were implemented prior to each police killing, I used the 2013 LEMIS database and matched it to the fatalities in 2015 and 16. So multiple agencies could be linked to any fatality or given fatality. The matching procedure resulted in about 450 agencies and 1,000 police killings, and I estimated incidence or fatality rate ratios adjusted for covariates. So to be clear, well, let me show you these. So listed in the column on the left, I essentially selected 13 policies expected to reduce deaths, like less lethal weapons force, and also improve officer behavior, like community evaluation. Okay, the columns from left to right, you see estimates for agencies involved in all killings, and then results stratified among agencies involved in white, in Black, and in non-white killings. Now, to be clear, the analysis compared fatality rates among agencies that had this protective policy against fatality rates of those who don't. So estimates below 1 represent lower rates, which is what we want. That's our outcome of interest. So here's what we found. Only 2 policies essentially predicted lower rates for all killings, but within the racial strata, we see greater proportions of full-time personnel, mission statements, community evaluation programs, and more personnel incentives predicted lower rates of police killings. And this was for white and non-white individuals. And increasing video use unexpectedly increased police killings among white people, but most notably, no policies were associated with Black deaths. So this work does point to some policies that potentially could help lower avoidable deaths, but the big picture here is that those that specifically purport to protect Black lives, like less lethal weapons use, right, community policing, were ineffective. So that suggests that there's some underlying anti-Black bias in policing, and this is a national sample. So then my question became, well then, how can we measure anti-Black bias directly to see its effect? And one way is the implicit association test. Have anybody heard of this? Okay, almost everyone. So very briefly, it's a computer-based test. It tests the speed of associations between, this is the race-based one, between black and white faces with positive and negative words. And the faster reaction time to, let's say, positive words and white faces and negative word and Black faces is supposed to reflect cognitive dissonance between Black people and positive things, or an implicit anti-Black bias. You can look into this method, but this is at the individual level. So what I did is I used the IAT to estimate area level anti-Black bias and COVID outcomes. And to do this, again, I love bringing together data sets. It's my thing. I use 3 different data sets for this. Now, area level bias essentially can be measured by aggregating racial bias data from individuals up to a geographically defined area. So I estimated the relationship at the county level, the association between implicit and explicit anti-Black biases and COVID-19 incidence and mortality that occurred in 2020. And so I combined 3 data sources. First, Project Implicit. Just so you know, this is an amazing data source. It's public use available data. It's housed at Harvard. It is large. There are about 3 million observations in it. And it's basically a bunch of tests, gender, race, all kinds of different biases. You can take it, it's free, anyone can do it anytime, and it goes into the database and they make it publicly available for everyone. So what we did is we downloaded all of the non-Hispanic white IET tests, and they had an explicit bias test too, not just implicit. So that was our exposure measure. Then we got our cases of mortality and incidence from Johns Hopkins. And then this was interesting. I can get into this later. We got data from the New York Times that they secured through a subpoena, or what, not subpoena, some other, they got it from the CDC, race specific, which was really hard to get in a subset of counties. But listed in the first column here, you can see our implicit and explicit measures. We go from left to right, you can see the rate estimates of overall mortality and incidence, then race-specific incidence, and then an incidence rate gap. And what we found is that higher county level implicit and explicit anti-Black bias were associated with higher overall mortality and incidence. For example, the second column here, it basically shows you that areas with higher bias had about 8 more cases per 10,000 people than areas with lower bias. Higher bias predicted higher rates for both Black and white incidents. And the incidence rate gap showed that for every 1 white case per 10,000 people, there were 6 Black cases. So this work, importantly, adds to a growing body of evidence that shows that racism is bad for everyone. It doesn't matter what racial group you are. If you live in an area that has higher racial bias, you're going to have worse outcomes. And again, this is just COVID, but there's a broad literature growing showing this, especially at the area level. So then I thought, okay, if anti-Black bias is bad, could pro-Black bias be good? Hence, that's what essentially informed my K99 research, taking a deep dive into how structural racism in higher education may have implications for Black adult health. And it's in part because a lot of my early work has shown the impact of educational attainment robustly. We were talking about this robustly. It's always education that seems to modify the effect of racism on the variety of forms I've studied and a variety of outcomes. So I'm sticking with education. And so this paper was published this year. We examined the impact of attending an HBCU versus a predominantly white institution on cognitive decline. The results I'm going to show you are just for cognition, though. I shouldn't say decline, just cognition. In a sample of Northern California Kaiser patients. Kaiser is a health system out in California. And we had 716 Black participants who attended college. We had cognitive measures, and I assessed executive function and verbal episodic memory. Okay, so here are the findings. This figure shows the adjusted standardized beta coefficients for the effects of college at mean age 70. So executive functions in purple, verbal episodic memories in magenta. And you can see that compared to PWI attendees, HBCU attendees average better executive function and better verbal memory. But as you can see, the confidence intervals are wide and they contain the null. So this is when I was like, part of the reason is because our studies that have cognitive data, as many of you may know, don't have a lot of Black people. So it was like, okay, I know I'm going to have to do something different. So I put together, let me skip through this, but these are the aims of my K. This is that first aim is essentially what you just saw, but in a harmonized data set. So harmonizing across 4 different data sets. I'm going to do a mediation analysis on whether or not you went to high school in close proximity to either institution, because I want to know, is being around Black excellence, whether you went to an HBCU or not, does that have an impact? And then, of course, policy analysis related to school funding at the state and federal level. These are the data sets that I'm going to be harmonizing in case anyone's interested in learning more about it. HRS, Regards, HSB, and Project Talent. And this is in part why I'm here, because HSB data is here and it's amazing. I'm so excited. I worked on it yesterday. It was really great. And yeah, so I just wanted to close with sharing some thoughts about what we can do to mitigate racism as a public health threat. We have to stop doing this. Because this is what ends up happening, right? We end up being in our silos, or I'm already preaching to the converted, and we already know what we need to do, but we're not going to those spaces where we need to expand what we're doing. So let's stop doing that. And just some ideas. I'm not going to go through all this because we've run out of time, but create spaces, use the IET in institutions, sponsor community building, increase diversity in STEM. I would not be here asking these questions if I didn't somehow make it out of the baby, right? And of course, I just hope now that you know what you know, not that you didn't know it before, but I encourage you to reflect on everything you've covered and ask yourself, how is racism operating here throughout your careers and your lives? And with that, I will acknowledge the massive amount of people responsible for all of this work, and a shout out to y'all here, especially Elizabeth and Coit for helping me with all the data stuff I've been working on. And that's it. And with that, I will close and thank you. A robust discussion, even though we got like 6 minutes. I know that sometimes it's hard to even talk about racism, but this is that safe space. Like, this is where we want to have this conversation.
When working on the space of racism, like, how do you think about framing findings for something like showing that HBCUs do in fact improve outcomes, and the idea that like having these segregated spaces can outcomes, and kind of the implications of like people who maybe aren't in the choir that you're teaching to see those data and kind of run with it in a different way. I work in a very different sphere, but it's like in abortion, and I feel like sometimes I'm doing research like this and I'm like, these are really important findings and research questions, but like, what the hell am I going to do with it? And it does show what I think it might show.
No, I love this question because again, it gets back to thinking about potential harm that you could be doing depending on how you are reporting your findings and interpreting them. Great question. This is also where social theory really comes in strongly to help answer that question, or how you would then conceptualize it and frame it to the public. But for example, there's a difference between segregation in the way that it's been used and the way that we talk about it versus cultural celebration, cultural excellence, cultural empowerment, right? And so when we're talking about HBCUs, that is how I intend to frame it. If the results are positive and good, it's what can happen when you celebrate a culture that is historically marginalized, right? Another way, another question I had to think about when I was writing this grant is, what if I found the opposite? What if I found that those who go to HBCUs have worse health, right? Like, how do I have to think about that? And so in some ways, if it was worse, there's a lot of reasons for that. For example, there's people who have higher education tend to be employed in places that are just more homogeneously white, right? On average. So that might have implication. Those benefits from being at HBCU might actually be mitigated by, ending up in a high powered position with a bunch of white people around you all the time, and then increasing your exposure to racism. So there's a lot of mechanisms and things you have to think about. Again, always go back to social theory. And if you're not comfortable with social theory, partner and collaborate with somebody who is. Great question. All things you have to think about.
They're done. They're done.
Okay, all right, so this is great. This was a lot of fabulous. I appreciate you.
That means a lot. Thank you.
So I have a question about like this idea of thinking about causality when we're thinking about this work, because there's a struggle when you're talking about something that's embedded, entrenched, and intentional that happens across all of these dimensions. And how can we even think about causality when we're thinking about and how we measure this work, right? I mean, measurement, I keep going back to this idea of measuring structural racism, because how much of this is like just taking how we're already measuring stuff and then renaming it and repackaging it as structural racism? And how do we make the distinction between just saying, we're just gonna use a dissimilarity index, which folks have been using for a minute, right?
Forever, yeah.
Exactly, learned about this in graduate school, been around a long time. So how do we then think about this measurement now? And think about what that means when we're just, is it just the repackaging is what I'm really struggling with when we think about structural racism.
I struggle with that too, and I understand that we have been very limited by the measures that we've had. One of the reasons why we use concentrations at the extreme and the dissimilarity is because that we have census data and we can try and leverage that to try and get at inequities and potential underlying mechanisms. So my short response is we need to do better with measures and stop trying to repackage the measures that we have. It's not that they're not useful. They are useful. They can be effective at informing certain aspects of the effects of racism. But if we are truly going to operationalize structural racism as a social determinant, we need to start thinking about how can I operationalize a process, a practice. For example, have you read Ossiput's paper using, a lot of people have used it now, but the mortgage lending practices? I love this measure. That is exactly what we need to be doing, because this measure, it shows you the racialized practice. So this measure is from the, it's mortgage lending, but it shows you who gets the mortgage, what race they were, where they were able to buy their house, the amount of interest that they paid. There, you can even get credit score information. Like, those are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about in terms of what are driving these inequitable distributions of resources, of opportunity, not trying to repackage the downstream effects of those policies, right? So that's my short answer. And I'm trying my best. I'm starting to work with other institutions to like get our hands on that county level data, that, you know, that financial data, which is really hard to get. So, you know, and there's some, that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about UTC. Can I just say, there's like financial data that I'm drooling over. I'm just like so obsessed with it. So that's my take. Yes.
So I'm curious, because one thing I've been struggling with is racism is geographic, right? So what does it mean if we're measuring structural racism at the school level, at the block level, track level, county level, state level? Especially when you're thinking about those being disparate, right? So if you think of Austin, I have problems, but if you think of Texas, we look really different.
Right.
So a lot of what we would think about when we're thinking about racism, we're thinking about people who are exposed to different levels of social racism, to different levels of racism. I'm just curious what you think about how those intersect and what they.
That's a great question. I wish I would have to think about that more deeply, but my initial response isn't really answering your question. It's more of what area level measures are relevant. If you're just trying to capture the climate, like the ambient social climate in a geographically defined space, okay, that's what I did with my my implicit and explicit bias. But if we're talking about what's impacting people in their neighborhoods, for example, or in their schools, we should be thinking about what are the policies and practices in that school that then determine that, right? See, I keep going back to the same mantra: policies, practices, norms. Like, what are the policies in the institution that are affecting the teaching staff, the hiring, pay scales, the quality of the education? What's impacting the environment? Is there green space? Are there places to play? Are there hazards? You know, that kind of thing. So when I think of area level measures, even if it's at the county, the city, schools, whatever, I'm not thinking about it in the way that are traditional. I'm thinking about it in just what is underlying that structure. What's keeping that structure operating this way that's harming people, and not necessarily comparing this area to that. And then just talking about income or talking about, just getting into a deeper dive. again, I know that didn't really answer your question, but I would have to think deeply about that.
Right, so
Yeah.
if you grow up in Austin and say you're in a school where it's very, the policies seem to be very promotive of, but you're in a state that says DEI is bad. And DEI, is it protective to be in that? Does that mitigate some of these larger level effects? So that's what I'm.
And to complicate your question even further, how might that look for somebody who comes from an environment that's much more protective, and then you end up
Exactly.
in areas that are less, like will that protect you then? And then vice versa. What if you come from an area that's all kinds of bias, and then you come here and you feel like the outsider and you're not really understanding the culture and like, you know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, that's what I'm saying. We'd have to have some coffee and a conversation about all that. But yeah,
Thank you so much. This was lovely.
thank you guys. And you have my email. This is my, my email is there. Please feel free to contact me anytime.